Welcome back to another video for my Paideia A class today, Ancient Greeks and the World of the Bible. What we've got displayed on our screen here is fairly simple. It's not altogether perfect. No timeline is going to be just perfect, but it's a fairly simple representation of some of the timeline of what we see in biblical history. Now, something we often forget is that social and cultural and international history is related to what we see in the Bible. And I'd like today to tie together those ancient Greeks, because that's where we usually track the beginning of world civilization, Western civilization specifically, and the world of the Bible, which has had just a tremendous influence on more modern Western civilization. We back up to the book of Genesis and the whole Pentateuch. You see Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, probably all from a very brief time period of history, at least being described. And in fact, all five of those books, and possibly Joshua, being written really at rather a similar time, roughly the time around 1400 BC. Well, what may be very interesting, and what I don't think many people have tied together with this, is the fact that in the secular world of archaeology, generally, people agree that there is a widespread settlement of the Mediterranean region roughly 2500 to 3000 BC. Now let's put that in our timeline here. You see again we've got the law given potentially right around 1446 BC, somewhere right around then. Well, if we back up another 1,000 years approximately, what we get is Abraham about 500 years before there. So we're getting close to 2000 BC with Abraham. And if we back up just a little bit farther, we see Noah, we see a worldwide flood, we see the Tower of Babel, as it's depicted in Genesis chapter 11. What do we see there? The whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there all over the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. Well, so we can look at and think about the idea that the people have been scattered, and they end up in all kinds of areas, especially around the Mediterranean. The population doesn't seem to be centered as heavily once you move farther away, which makes perfect sense as people migrate. Well, what's happening in the Greek world, because that's where we're going to start our big literary journey, what happens in the Greek world shortly after this episode at Babel? If we move up to somewhere around shortly after 2000 BC, maybe 1800 BC or thereabouts, the time of Isaac and Jacob. What we're going to see is a palace world, which we know sometimes we'll refer to as the Minoan Palace Society. What we find is that there are large buildings. They are furnished very elegantly. There have been findings of storerooms with golden artifacts, yes, real gold. And what's really interesting is these buildings seem to have very few defensive walls. So they don't have much of a way of keeping invaders out. Now that suggests that this very wealthy, very elaborate, very developed culture also had a relatively low fear of crime, or else they would have built fortifications of all sorts. After all, people have always known how to hide behind a wall. And you can build a wall out of almost anything. Well, we have the Minoans, and they apparently disappear at some point or are replaced by a group of people we know as the Mycenaeans. And the Mycenaeans have more warlike palaces. They start emerging somewhere around 1500 BC. And they last for about 300 years or so. They have heavier fortifications. They do not appear to be quite as wealthy. And yet they build elaborate buildings. They have artwork. They have fancy burials. You can find evidence of soldiers from wars back in this time period being buried with their bronze armor and with some jewelry and with a sword or a shield or both, and possibly some other artifacts such as pottery. And you may find some of these tombs from the Mycenaean time period. However, we know relatively little about these Minoan or Mycenaean people, again, back in this time period, before the time of the book of Deuteronomy, because something happened right around the year 1100 BC. I've seen people date it as closely as saying 1125 BC, but I've never seen their compelling reason for saying it was really then. So let's say around 1100 BC. There seems to be some evidence of people marauding and taking over and burning and pillaging and stealing, and apparently many of the powerful people within the Mycenaean society fled or were killed, and we never see anything of them again. These marauders seem to have entered the Greek world from the north. We don't know quite where. To put it in context, this time period of around 1100 BC happens to line up with the time of the book of Judges, when you see Israel was having marauders and people attack them as well. Well, in the Greek world, this ushered in what we call the Greek Dark Ages. And if you think the European Middle Ages are dark, they don't have anything in relationship to the Greek Dark Ages. During the Greek Dark Ages, there was a tremendous rollback of technology. Evidence for boat building before the Dark Ages used pegs and even some sort of nails in construction. After the Dark Ages, they tied logs together with rope. Before the Dark Ages, there is evidence of writing. After the Dark Ages, writing had to be reinvented with a completely different alphabet, because nobody remembered the old one. The writing, the technology, the literature largely disappeared. What did survive was a heroic tradition. Traditions, stories, myths about mighty warriors, about a great war, about a time of plenty, about a time of people going here and there, trading wealthy gifts, rich treasures, people eating tremendous amounts of food, people being well warmed and well fed and well clothed. There's this heroic tradition that survives through these dark ages. Well, there's a gradual restoration of culture in Greece around the year, between about 850 and 800 BC. Now we see things have been cooking along quite nicely within the biblical culture as well. Well, maybe it's not so nice. Israel has fallen apart. It's been divided into Israel and Judah, and the kingdom of Israel is shortly going to be taken over by the Assyrian kingdom. Some of these marauders who will take them and all their treasures away. Over in Greece, though, by about the year 800, things are coming back to life. And that's about the time that we have the rise of two important authors and one important school of thought. The two important authors who we'll study in a couple of weeks are Hesiod and Homer. Hesiod, famous for two works. One is called Theogony, about the way the pagan gods and the earth came to be. The other, called Works and Days, about how to govern yourself in this world. And then Homer, the legendary author of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And then also we have a very interesting little collection of poems which are in the same poetic meter used by Hesiod and Homer, and these are called the Homeric hymns. They're about all kinds of different topics, mostly of a religious nature, pointing people to the Greek pagan gods and goddesses and the way the world seems to work. And that really arises between about 800 and 700 BC, maybe pushing more into the area of 700 BC. Well, so we've taken people from a long, long time ago, first evidence of widespread settlement in Greece, all the way up through the Greek Dark Ages to around the 7th or 8th century BC in 13 and a half minutes. I look forward to reading Hesiod and Homer and a Homeric hymn with people in the near future. So long.